Boa noite. Boa noite, meus estoicos seguidores. Good evening, my fellow Stoics. Um, Tonight, this episode 97 from LIVREMENTE will be a program in English language. So, sorry for those who are used to have this show in Portuguese language, but today we're going to do this program in English. My name is Ivandro Monteiro. I'm a clinical psychologist, psychotherapist, and university professor. And we have this show every Tuesday since January 2021. And we are trying to give science with metaphors and examples in order for people to know themselves and to understand better how the human behavior works. So this show usually I do it myself or sometimes with several guests. And tonight, in our 97th episode, we will have with us Donald Robertson. Donald Robertson, he is a psychotherapist, a cognitive psychotherapist, and a well-known Stoic philosopher. And he is also one of the founding members of the modern Stoicism, which is a non-profit organization. And he was born in Scotland, but now he lives in Canada and in Greece. Robertson is the author of several books on philosophy and psychotherapy, and including Stoicism and the Art of Happiness and How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. This is one of his books that I have here that I can show you. It's one of the well-known books, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. And this is most recent one, which is Verissimus from Donald Robertson and the artist Zé Nuno Fraga, awarded Portuguese artist that we have with us. And tonight we have with us Donald Robertson. Let me just check if he is here. And okay, I don't know if you can hear me well and you can see me well. Hi, Donald, the camera, the reverse side.
Here we go.
Oh, can you hear me well? Can you see me well?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Well, thank you very much for being here in this program and to talk to the Portuguese audience, the Portuguese community around the world. And I hope that we can have a interesting conversation for them to make some questions and to chat with us about a thing that I believe that it's really important, which is Stoicism and how is it important in nowadays life. So first of all, thank you very much for being here with us. Your recent book, Verissimus, is a magnificent book, which for those who like story, history, and drawing, and banda desenhada, which is what we say in Portuguese about this quality of design. And so this is something I would completely recommend to our audience to have this book. So what is Stoicism? That's something that most people sometimes, or most of the times, they misunderstood what is Stoicism. What is to be a Stoic?
Well, first of all, historically, Stoicism is a Greek school of philosophy. It was heavily inspired by Socrates and the earlier philosophers, but it was founded around about 300 BC by a Phoenician merchant who arrived at Athens. And it survived for about 500 years in antiquity. The last famous Stoic of antiquity is the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who died in 180 AD. So people may have seen him in the movie Gladiator, for example, being played by Richard Harris, right? And he wrote a very famous book called The Meditations, which is one of the most popular self-help classics of all time. And in Stoicism, we get a big philosophy, a complex philosophy that evolved over the 500 years, but its central doctrine is relatively simple, and it's an ethical doctrine. So it's based on the ethical doctrine derived from Socrates that virtue, or arete in Greek, which could also be translated as moral wisdom, is the only true good. Now, most Greek philosophers agreed that arete was perhaps the most important thing in life. But the Stoics went a little bit further and said it's the only intrinsically important thing in life. And the other things that...
It's a way of, sorry for interrupting, but what you're saying is that maybe it's a way that people should consider to find a peaceful way of living, to go with a more peaceful and accepting the nature as it is, considering the things that you cannot control in life.
Yeah, I would say that that's kind of a consequence or a side effect of this system of values. So if you say that virtue is the only true good thing, or truly good thing in life, then it implies that there are other things that seem good but aren't as important as people normally assume. And the Stoics would say health, wealth, reputation seem intrinsically important, but maybe aren't as important as moral wisdom. And the consequence of this, so that's a moral philosophy, but it has a psychological consequence, which you've kind of touched on. So if someone really believes that moral wisdom, which is under their control, the way they think, is the most important thing in life, and wealth and reputation are unimportant or of secondary importance, then that person who really believes that would be less upset if they lost their wealth or lost their reputation. So they would have
more within, right? It's something that comes from within, the moral, those moral virtues.
Within. So that person would have what we tend to call in English today emotional resilience. And so Stoicism has become almost synonymous with emotional resilience. Now, that's one of the reasons that today psychologists and psychotherapists are kind of interested in what the Stoics had to say.
But sometimes people, even today, I was talking with a colleague, with an American colleague, and sometimes the emotional Stoicism is kind of misunderstood, because people consider Stoicism as a kind of denial of emotions, so a rejection of emotion, and that's really wrong, right? It's a really wrong concept from the original concept.
Yeah, so this is a confusion that is important to clear up. It's all over the internet. It's a very common misconception. Now, many words from ancient Greek philosophy in English and probably in Portuguese and other languages today have changed their meaning over time. So the ancient Greeks talked about cynicism, skepticism, Epicureanism as philosophies. Today, those words mean something quite different. The meaning has changed and become watered down over the centuries.
And very reduced also.
Yeah, very. So Stoicism now is sometimes used to mean having a stiff upper lip, as we say in English, or technically, I would say suppressing or concealing unpleasant or embarrassing emotions. And there's a body of research on Stoicism, which is usually in English spelled with a lowercase s in this sense. So this unemotional coping style, there's a body of research that shows that it's harmful in many cases, that when people conceal or suppress unpleasant emotions, it doesn't work out very well for them. It's not healthy.
And we see that in some cases where research shows that when they do that, for example, the risk of cancer increases.
Yeah, and there's also a rebound effect whereby the emotions often become stronger. So people who try to conceal or suppress anxiety, for example, tend to experience more anxiety in the long term. And also, well, I know will probably be of interest to you professionally, people who are lowercase s stoic and suppress or conceal emotion are less likely to go and see you, to go and see a clinician, a therapist, or to seek support from their family. So they have poor social support mechanisms for coping with their psychological problem because they want to deny them or conceal them. And so that makes them vulnerable in the longer term. The irony is that people who have lowercase s stoicism and suppress emotions often think they're being tough. They think it's a macho thing.
Yeah, that's the biggest misunderstood today. People confuses that.
What the research tells us is like almost the opposite, that in the long term they're more vulnerable, they're more fragile, rather than being more tough. And Stoicism, the philosophy with a capital S.
And about that, we can also add that rejection or denial or denial and rejection is the mother of obsession. So you even become much more obsessed with the issue that you are trying to deny. So it increases the suffering in people the more you deny the emotions that you have.
And the more extreme your existing mental health problems are, it seems the more damaging suppression or concealing can be. So someone who has obsessive compulsive disorder, for example, it's quite a severe anxiety disorder, potentially does themselves more harm by trying to suppress their emotions than someone who doesn't have a diagnosis, for instance.
Because it's even our instinct, because the instinct in our nature leads for the expression. So we are it's sadness and suffering is always trying to increase consciousness in our lives. And the more you are aware of the things that makes you suffer and you don't deny those things, the more you accept those things in order to work with them, to change and to make things happen, to make the changes in life. So it's really crucial for people to understand the difference and the impact of denying those emotions.
Absolutely. So I said we have some research that shows this, but capitalist Stoicism, Stoic philosophy, inspired modern cognitive behavioral psychotherapy, for which there are hundreds and hundreds of studies that demonstrate its effectiveness for a range of problems. So
I believe that Aaron Beck confessed that in his work, that he created cognitive behavioral therapy based on the Stoicism philosophy.
He says so. He says it's the philosophical inspiration for cognitive therapy, but even earlier than Aaron Beck, Albert Ellis, who was first in the 1950s in America. This also, and Ellis also quotes the Stoics very frequently in his writings. So Ellis said this, and then Beck said this, and often they'll quote Epictetus to illustrate the cognitive model of emotion. So they'll say it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. Which Ellis taught this quote to all of his clients and all of his students, and he quotes Epictetus in most of his books. So this became very famous among cognitive behavioral therapists. So Stoic philosophy inspired cognitive therapy, very simply, is good for mental health, but lowercase Stoicism, which involves suppressing emotions, is known to be bad for mental health. So although they both are spelled the same way, it would be really bad to confuse something that we know is bad for mental health with something that we know is good for mental health.
Yeah. Sometimes the mistake was probably using the same words, having the same language, when we could use different words to have these different meanings. Yeah. And one of the things that also we can understand with the history of Stoicism is that we can consider that we have two Stoicisms: one before Christ, which is less religious, and another one which has more religion on it. So what are the differences between these two, before and after Christ?
Well, I would go a little bit further and say that Stoicism, in a sense, influenced early Christianity, and in particular, many scholars believe that Stoicism influenced St. Paul. And in fact, in the New Testament, Paul, in the Acts of the Apostles, is depicted at the Areopagus in Athens, delivering a lecture to the Stoics and the Epicurean philosophers. So the Stoics are actually mentioned in the Bible, and Paul quotes a guy called Aratus, who was a student of Zeno and is believed to be a Stoic. So he quotes some Stoic poetry to them. So the Stoics are intertwined with the very origins of Christianity. Um, so there was a kind of relationship between early Christians and Stoicism, a rivalry, but also some influence. And then following the Reformation, there was increasing interest, and following the Renaissance, increasing interest in Stoicism. There was a movement in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries called Neo-Stoicism, where a number of authors combined Stoicism with Christian thought. Mm-hmm. And the main difference, I suppose, first of all, I'll say one of the main similarities is the Stoics really emphasized this idea of the brotherhood of man, which was a novel and controversial idea at the time. So the Stoics argued that all human beings were kin. They were part of a single family, and they were all citizens of a single cosmos. It sounds like the kingdom of God. And so this idea paved the way and influenced early Christian thinkers, arguably.
So it has a very significant contribute for building civilizations and to build democracies in the way that we have common values between us, to work together, to live together, and to worry with each other in a more altruistic way, instead of being so selfish or so focused on pleasures.
I'll mention this very briefly because it would take us off at a historical tangent, but I mention it because it's very interesting. Plutarch, who's a later author in the Roman Empire in Greece, he claims that Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia inspired the Stoic philosophers who came about a generation later to introduce what we call ethical cosmopolitanism. So he claims, Plutarch says that Aristotle, who was the teacher of Alexander, told Alexander that the barbarian people, as he called them, by which he meant the Persians and other tribes, were less than human. And allegedly Aristotle said they were to be viewed as plants or animals rather than fully fleshed human beings. And Alexander, according to Plutarch, disagreed with this and said, no, as far as I'm concerned, if these people want to speak our language and fight alongside us, then they're Greeks, in my view. And that became the beginning of the empire that Alexander founded, and that was taken over in a fragmentary form by his successors. Became the Hellenistic era in European history. But this idea that the world wasn't divided into different tribes and races, but that everybody could potentially be part of a single community, inspired philosophers to begin thinking of a world community. We call this cosmopolitanism in philosophy. And
that's when you bring the idea from Stoicism, from the old Stoicism, the idea of accepting what we cannot control. Because if we take nature and things as they are, because you can change what they are, maybe together we can have an action in the things that you can actually change.
This idea, I mean, one of the central principles of Stoicism, it's actually the first sentence of the Handbook of Epictetus, says some things are up to us and other things are not. And the Stoics go on to repeatedly explain that we should take more responsibility for the things that are under voluntary control, and we should learn to be more indifferent, more accepting towards things that are not under our control. And this is expressed in the Serenity Prayer, which became very famous, particularly in America, as it's used in Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. And it says, God, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom.
The wisdom.
To know
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, this aspect of Stoicism, I don't think is very explicitly emphasized in modern cognitive behavioral therapy. It's kind of implicitly there, but it's usually not stated as much upfront as explicitly. But there was an early 20th century form of psychotherapy developed by a Swiss neurologist called Paul Dubois, who was the main rival of Sigmund Freud. And Dubois developed what was called rational psychotherapy, or persuasion psychotherapy, at the beginning of the 20th century. And Dubois was a big fan of Seneca, who originated from Spain, Cordoba.
Yeah.
And Seneca, Dubois used to prescribe reading Seneca to his clients. And the main aspect of Stoicism that Dubois taught to his clients was this distinction between what's up to us and what isn't. We call it the dichotomy of control sometimes. So there was an early 20th century form of psychotherapy that was very influential, that explicitly taught Seneca's Stoicism and really focused on this idea that you're talking about. But then it got forgotten about. And Stoicism became popular again in the 1950s and 1960s with Albert Ellis and then Aaron Beck, but they focused on a slightly different aspect of it, this aspect that has to do with our opinions shaping our emotions.
And it's really important, this part that you're expressing, because if we take this analysis and interpretation for the clinical practice with patients, the more I expect things from what I can't control, the more victim I'll feel in my life. So I'll feel much more a victim the more I expect from things that I cannot control. So if I take the responsibility in what I can do with what it is, then I can actually become almost like not the hero of the story, but a kind of calm hero and the soft hero of the story, a more regulated person dealing with the things that I can control.
This is how we would say it today. The Stoics put it in stronger terms. In their language, Seneca says it's the difference between being a slave and being free. And he was a slave. He was a freed slave. So he said, as long as you make your happiness and well-being depend on things that are not under your control, then you enslave yourself to them. And the only way you can liberate or emancipate or free yourself is to learn, to invest more importance on the things that are directly under your control. That's where your psychological liberation and freedom lies. And the Stoics compare this to being a free man or even being a king. Seneca, the Stoics love paradoxes, and they would say that Diogenes the Cynic, who lived like a beggar, was nevertheless essentially a king because he had complete freedom. Whereas Alexander the Great, who reputedly met with him, like the Stoics would say, was enslaved. Although he was the most powerful man in the world, he was enslaved with his desire for glory and fame, which was entirely under his control.
That would be that could be almost like the worst prison in our lives, the prison that we block ourselves in our own minds with that expectation from the things that we can't control. So most of the suffering comes from that, from those expectations, because we become much more free when we don't expect nothing from the things that we cannot control.
It reminds me of a quote. Socrates reputedly said when he was in prison awaiting execution, somebody said to him, it must be terrible being in prison. And Socrates said, well, anyone that's somewhere that they don't want to be is in prison. But he said, but I don't mind being here. So really, I'm not in prison.
That's almost like the secret from having a good life. Uh, this Considering this evolution along the centuries until now, and now we can say that we have a modern Stoicism. What is the modern Stoicism nowadays?
Well, the way I look at it, I don't think modern Stoicism is really a thing. I think it's just a bunch of people who are interested in ancient Stoicism. And many of them change it. They adapt it and they modify it. But the ancient Stoics modified their ideas as well. Ancient Stoicism was around for 500 years, as we've seen, and then it influenced Christianity. So people interpreted it in different ways. Seneca is not the same as Epictetus. They're different interpretations of Stoicism. Marcus Aurelius is different. Cicero was not a Stoic, but he was very interested in Stoicism and studied it, and he took bits of Stoicism. He was more eclectic. And it's the same today. Some people are interested in Stoicism and they interpret it in a very theological way. Other people are atheists or agnostics and they're interested in Stoicism. And other people are more into Buddhism, but maybe they take little bits of Stoicism away. They're more eclectic.
For example, clinically speaking, it's really useful because, for example, not only in cognitive behavioral therapy, but for example, in one of my specialties, which is interpersonal psychotherapy, which one of the focus of the therapy is in a short-term intervention to increase the empowerment of the person in order to separate the problem from the person. She has to understand where she is, what is the power zone, what can she do with what she has in this moment, according to the context, the people that she's surrounded. What can I do to make things happen, or what do I have to accept in this environment and in this context? And the more I can increase the consciousness about those environments and the quality of those relationships, and mainly considering the way that we think about life, we can change the view from a narrative of a victim to a narrative of an a more entrepreneur or more hero person of the story. So we could see the tree, or you could see the forest.
What this reminds me of, this idea of role identification in psychology, in part, is I think what you're alluding to. And interestingly, the ancient Stoics talked about the concept of roles and the way that we fulfill those roles in a similar way. And this discussion, I believe, goes all the way back to a passage in Plato's Republic, where Socrates is talking about Greek tragedies. So he's talking about acting, and he says that the Greek tragedies, the figures, the protagonists in the Greek tragedies often make their circumstances worse for themselves by the way that they respond to them. And it's fascinating to watch, but the risk is that they then provide very unhealthy role models for the audience. And the person he's talking to in the Republic is surprised by this, because it sounds like Socrates is being quite critical of high art. But Socrates says, you need to pause for a minute and think that a wise man or a wise woman would have responded very differently from the way, for example, that Oedipus responds, or characters in other Greek tragedies respond. And then that leads him into a discussion about how a wise individual might respond with greater resilience in the face of adversity, whereas the protagonists in Greek tragedies often act in quite a neurotic way, and in a way they're case studies in psychopathology.
Expect for the worst, but act for the best.
Yeah.
So that would be a nice model for them to deal with those issues, and it's really interesting because the more we are aware of our ability to manage the thoughts facing the environments and the people, the way we react to things, life is much more about what we do with what happened to us and not about what really happens to us. So it's a really big difference, because I could see myself as a victim of my past experiences, and I'm what I am because of what I lived. But there's another Stoic perspective, which would be I am what I am because of what I lived, and because of what I lived, I appreciate it, because I became more and who I am because of the meaning of the suffering that I gave to my experience, my past experience. So the more we have a meaning for the suffering, the more mature you become, and the less meaning you give to suffering, the more bitter person you become. So, and this is really important, because you can actually work with this with using Stoicism, with life stories of people.
I think so. I think another important aspect that's related to this is the Stoics believe that the cognitive theory of emotion. So they believe that the way that we think about things, the narrative that we construct, the story that we tell ourselves, fundamentally shapes whether we're angry or sad or anxious about an event. And Socrates likes to point out to people, as did the Stoics later, that two different people might feel quite differently about the same event. And Socrates will say to people, why does someone else feel differently about this event? Is it that they're telling themselves different things about it? They have a different attitude, a different way of looking at it, or they have a different narrative about it. We call this cognitive distancing sometimes in modern therapy. It's just the realization, in a way, that there are other ways of looking at a situation.
It's like reducing the absolute view of the problem and have a more relative perspective of the problem. And
yes,
you need that distance to do it.
And we can call this cognitive flexibility as well. It's the ability to look at something from different perspectives, have a more versatile, more flexible way of responding to it, rather than having tunnel vision and being trapped in one unhealthy way of looking at an event.
Yeah. And this new book that you published, which is Verissimus, what can people find here? The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius. Why is Marcus Aurelius so important in Stoicism? And why did you decide to do this book?
Well, I should probably mention first of all that the artist that illustrated the book is called Zé Nuno Fraga. Is Portuguese. It's probably worth mentioning. The artwork's Portuguese. We chose to write about Marcus Aurelius because he's the most famous Stoic, and we know more about his life than we know about any other Stoic. We possibly know more about Marcus Aurelius' life than we do about pretty much any other ancient philosopher. And the reason for that was that he was a Roman emperor. So we have his private letters, we have his legal decisions, we have inscriptions and statues, we have him mentioned in a number of histories that describe the events of his life.
And it's interesting because his life, when he wrote, for example, Meditations, he was not planning to publish that work. So it was his notes to deal with and cope with his own issues, right? For several years during the wars.
We're pretty certain that he never intended to publish this. For several reasons. He says things in it that would have probably insulted some people, and he says things in it that would have been politically controversial, I think. And also he says things that are kind of personal and vague that would mean nothing to readers. So he talks about a letter that one of his teachers wrote to his mother, but he doesn't say what was in the letter. So that looks like he wrote it for himself. It wasn't meant for other people to read, for instance. And we see it's an extraordinary thing, because normally historical figures, we learn about the events of their life. And we do have histories that describe the events of Marcus's life. But here we also can see inside his mind, because he writes his thoughts down. So we have an internal record of what was going on in his mind.
In the
and was,
chronological perspective also, because he was facing wars when he was traveling in several years, and he lost wives and sons, and he lived a lot of suffering in those moments.
yeah, the plague,
In the plague, exactly, yes.
a pandemic. He lived through the Antonine Plague, which was a pandemic. So you could perhaps say that, in a sense, the Meditations is like an emotional coping manual for dealing with a pandemic. And also, he was a military fortress in Austria when he wrote most of it in Carnuntum on the Danube. So in warfare and a plague, he's writing this. And he faces a civil war, and probably just after he finished writing it.
Yeah. And what can we find in the story that you present us in Verissimus? What is the main message that you'd like to share with the ones who have this opportunity of reading a great book?
Well, there are many, many ideas and techniques that are mentioned in it, but we picked anger as the main problem that we wanted to highlight because it's very important to ancient Stoics. They thought it was one of the main problems we need to deal with. I personally believe that anger management is the royal road to self-improvement today for the following reason. There are three main types of negative emotion: anger, fear, and sadness. We often say are the three broad categories. Now, people who are depressed or sad and people who are anxious or afraid often seek therapy. But people who are angry typically don't seek therapy. And in fact, therapists often see angry people because they're referred by their spouses, or if they're in an institution. Like if they're in the military.
I just came to this session because my wife wanted to come here, because if it was me, I wouldn't come here.
Yeah, exactly. Or it could be they're in the military or a prison or a school, and they're sent by the institution for anger management. But angry people think everyone else needs therapy. So they tend to externalize or blame their emotions on other people. And for that reason, we live in a culture now where self-help advice is all over the internet. But in many cases, people are not addressing their anger because they have a blind spot for anger. And so, in fact, I would say, perhaps controversially, that some of the self-improvement advice that people receive today in a roundabout way actually makes them have more of a problem with anger and aggression. So an obvious example of that, I'll point to an individual which maybe is controversial, but Andrew Tate, the guy who's currently in police custody in Romania, is a massive self-improvement guru, but seems to have a following of very angry young men who often say quite misogynistic things that are aggressive or blaming towards women. But there's a paradox that this is a self-improvement course and program that he runs. People go to him for a type of therapy, self-help, but they seem very angry. I think it's a good example of how people have a blind spot for their anger and often don't do anything to work on anger.
And I think it's really common because I get people from several parts of the world in several countries, and I see that in Portuguese and in English language, and one of the things that we can see as common to everyone is that if we look at the speech and the critic and the anger that people express to everything that surrounds them, the common thing in 20 or 30 or 40 things that are wrong around them, it's the same person. So I'm the common factor. So I can't be the blind spot. I need to address myself to understand why am I the problem in my perspective. So that's a winning perspective.
I think so. Again, about personal responsibility. And anger, arguably, out of all of the emotions, is the one that potentially poses the most risk for society. in the sense that I think it's easy to see examples all over the world now, but we've all seen on television examples of today, actually, just before I came on this call, there was a school shooting in America again today. So
Wow.
we can see domestic extremism, violence, also just at a personal level, domestic abuse caused by anger. And the Stoics knew this. They said anger is the most dangerous emotion to other people and to society as a whole.
It hurts the other one. It addresses and hurts the other person. So it destroys the environment that we are surrounded.
Yeah, it can lead to killing people. Like it can lead to war. Like it's very dangerous. And one of the reasons for that is that cognitively, anger. When people are very angry, they tend to have certain cognitive biases, and many cognitive. But one of them is that angry people typically underestimate risk. So that means they expose themselves and the people they care about to greater risk than normal.
And one of the roads that we can actually see as a way to become an angry person would be the easily offended way of dealing with the world nowadays, because we can't say nothing almost to anyone because people become easily offended. And that's really a problem, because that usually leads to angry environments and to aggression between people.
Anger, people often foster their anger and cling on to it because they think it makes them tough, for example. But the irony is that anger is usually based on perceived threat. So I get angry with you because I think you're going to hurt me, or you're going to hurt something or someone that I care about. So anger really is based on fear in most cases. Like there's a insecurity and a perceived threat which may not be real or may be exaggerated. So it's a vulnerability underlying anger. Easy to detect, and the Stoics were very aware of this as well. They thought it's masking an underlying fear or vulnerability, but in a way that potentially poses a great danger to society. And Marcus Aurelius, I want to mention, Marcus Aurelius in the Meditations does something really remarkable. He talks a lot about ideas that are therapeutic, but he's not writing a systematic textbook. However, in one of the passages, Book 11, passage 18, he does something that's quite helpful just by coincidence. He creates a list of psychological techniques for coping with anger, and there are 10 of them. He lists 10, and they're all, we could say in therapy, there are cognitive strategies, behavioral strategies. He lists 10 cognitive strategies for anger management. So that passage is very interesting, or should be very interesting to psychotherapists, because it shows how sophisticated and how diverse his thinking was. If I spoke to, I used to teach psychotherapists, and I used to be a supervisor, psychiatrists, psychologists, life coaches would come on courses that I ran. If I said to the audience, and I had a flip chart, a whiteboard, and I said, "Hey, can you guys name how many cognitive strategies can you guys name for coping with anger?" I think the audience would have to kind of think for a few minutes, and maybe they'd come up with 3 or 4 or 5. I think even with a room of 20 or 30 coaches and therapists, they would struggle to list 10 distinct cognitive strategies. But Marcus Aurelius, writing nearly 2,000 years ago, has no problem listing 10 distinct cognitive strategies specific for coping with anger. And that suggests to me that he had quite a sophisticated grasp of therapy.
And it's interesting and important to bring that to our conscious, which is one of the virtues and one of the things that Marcus Aurelius had at the time is that he had time to think. because he had time to meditate. He had time to analyze his behavior, his thoughts, his environment, his connections, his communication. And today, people have a lot of difficulty in having the time to dedicate themselves to their self-improvement. We want everything in the moment. We want everything in a click. We want everything for yesterday. And that is a problem, because no one becomes mature enough when you don't give the time to do that work with yourself. So it's a complex process to make that analysis. We need to offer time for ourselves.
The Stoics talk quite a lot about the importance of time as a commodity and how we waste a great deal of our time thinking about things that aren't under our control. For example, ruminating about the distant past, like worrying about hypothetical events in the future that might never happen. A great deal of our lives is wasted thinking about things that, in a sense, aren't real or aren't relevant. Yeah. We spend half our lives or more in what Fritz Perls used to call the fantasy zone, like by which he meant, just in our head, like wrapped up in worry or rumination.
And it's interesting because all the lives that we could have lived are always better than the ones that we lived.
Yeah, absolutely. And we often make the mistake. Marcus Aurelius once said that when we imagine things that are absent as if they were present, we cultivate desire or craving for them. What would be better, what we'd like to have. And he said this is the kind of recipe psychologically for fueling craving and desire, to visualize or imagine things being present which we don't actually have. Oh, I wish I had this car, I wish I had this big house. And he says it's less common and requires more effort for people to imagine things that are present as if they were absent. So, for example, wow, imagine I didn't have this car. Imagine what it would be like if I didn't have this house. Now, he says if we do that, what we potentially cultivate is gratitude.
Exactly.
And that's a much healthier response.
Because that's a winning point to have a good life, right? We don't need too much to have a good life. Usually it needs that gratitude perspective of appreciating the things that we actually get in this moment. So if in this moment I have more than I had yesterday, even though I'm not where I am or what I want to be, but today, if I look at my life history today, I'm in the best position ever. So I should appreciate and be grateful about the moment that I have in this moment. And that's really difficult today because people have a lot of comparisons all the time. So every time you compare, you're always in the worst position, right?
Yeah. We sometimes talk in cognitive therapy about people making upward or downward comparisons. And there's some research that shows that people with depression and generalized anxiety disorder tend to make more upward comparisons than normal. So they compare themselves to celebrities, for instance, and that makes them feel anxious and depressed. Whereas people, actually, you and I, we live in the first world, so we're actually very privileged. Like, speaking here just now, and also if we broaden our perspective and think about history, like we're far more privileged than 99% of human beings in the history of the human race.
We could say that this is the best world ever that ever existed, comparing with what it was.
Marcus Aurelius would think, like we're living in the future compared to him. Like we have so much that people in the ancient world didn't have. As you get older, I'm old enough that I can remember even when I was a boy, we didn't have the internet. My parents didn't have a car. We didn't have central heating. We didn't have a microwave oven. We didn't have a fridge or a freezer in our house. And so
we had a real life internet.
Yeah, I'm lucky that I can remember that. And now I think, it's amazing now that we have the internet and we have all these conveniences that even in my lifetime we didn't used to have. And many people around the world still don't have. Perhaps the majority of people in the world still don't have. So if we make this is something that's called a downward comparison, it tends to be more appreciative or experience more gratitude. And the Stoics knew this. But if you want to be anxious and depressed, then compare yourself to the richest man in the world. You'll always be anxious and depressed if you do that.
And social networks and the internet brought a lot of those that increase of suffering, because there's a research that came out last week or 2 weeks ago that expresses that when we are comparing the 90s with the beginning of the 2000, the first decade of 2000, and since 2010 until now, when smartphones came with the apps after 2010, the increase of anxiety and depression and the increase of automutilation and self-harm and suicide attempts increased almost double or more in the last 10 years. And one of the most strongest variables that lead to this increase is the amount of time that people stay in social networks making comparisons to other lives. The more I compare myself with, and that's a thing, because, for example, in Instagram or TikTok, every time someone puts a story in the stories, we see 5 or 6 good moments of their lives. And if I have 100 friends with 5 stories each, I'm going to have 500 moments of real good life, and I'm the victim. I'm the one who is not having those lives. So yeah, it's really bad if we don't understand and we are not aware of the impact that can do to our lives.
It's selective, and selectivity we know is one of the main ways in which people are deceived, by giving them only a slice or a fragment of the information. When people suffer from mental health problems like anxiety and depression, their thinking itself becomes quite selective. When someone is depressed, if a depressed person writes a book and they get 99 good reviews for their book and 1 bad review, a depressed person might ignore the 99 good reviews and spend all day thinking about the 1 bad review. So they can be very selective.
We become good in what we think about, right? So if you are thinking about negative things, you'll become good on negative things.
Yeah, become adept, skilled at thinking about it. But social media also does this for us. Like it shows us, like you say, a very selective picture of other people's lives, and also there are filters on the videos and things. Like literally, the information that we get is distorted and filtered and highly selective. And also it encourages us to think in terms of likes. So if the philosophers, Greek philosophy, I wouldn't say it originated, but the formative period in Greek philosophy, it was shaped very profoundly by contact with a group of thinkers called the Sophists. And the Sophists were, you might say, the ancient precursors of modern social media influencers. The Sophists were people who were orators, and they gave lifestyle or self-help advice, and they said whatever would get them the biggest round of applause. They toured the world, they were like rock stars, they get paid a huge amount of money, but they learned that they should adapt what they were saying to please their audience and to get the biggest reaction from them. So Socrates in particular was concerned that this meant that they'd sold out completely. They'd abandoned truth, and because they were simply trying to please an audience. And this is, today we do this. If we make a video and only 10 people watch it, or only a handful of people like it, social media is trying to train us to say different things to get a bigger response from our audience. And that's dangerous.
Yeah, because it leads to the idea that most of the time we are getting what we want, but not what we need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And to end, because our time is flying by, and it has been a great talk. there are four virtues that the Stoics defend, and I think these four virtues are really, really important for people to recover, to remind them, to tell them. What are those four virtues that makes us more peaceful to dealing with life?
Well, the virtues in Greek philosophy, and they probably go back to Socrates or Plato, are wisdom, justice, fortitude, and temperance, or you could say wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline or moderation. And really, for the Stoics and for Socrates, wisdom is the most important virtue, and the other virtues consist in wisdom being applied to different areas of life. So they say that wisdom being applied to our relationships takes the form of the kaiosune in Greek, which means justice but also kindness combined. The English translation is not very good. So it means more than justice. It also means kindness in Greek, or compassion, you might say. And then the Stoics would say, if you want to go around acting with wisdom and justice, there's a problem, which is fear and desire get in the way. And so in order to act consistently with wisdom and justice, you would need to have courage to master your fears, and you would need temperance or self-discipline to overcome temptation. And so you need these four disciplines in order to live wisely in a social world without being led astray by temptations and fears.
Yeah. And it's about courage. People usually forget that without fear, you can never be courageous. So courage can only exist if you keep the fear under your control.
Yeah, you can't have a courageous robot because you have to experience anxiety or some semblance of fear. Seneca actually explicitly makes this point. He says it's a kind of paradox in a way that someone who is completely without fear could not be courageous. And likewise, someone who is completely without desire could not exhibit self-discipline. Or you can't have a self-disciplined robot. Again, if you didn't have cravings or temptations or desires, you couldn't exercise the virtue of self-discipline.
So accept the emotion, but you have to deal with that emotion to regulate the emotion in order to function and not being a slave of the emotion.
Yeah. The Stoics want us to accept, but to make they also want to make a distinction. I would say a point I would make. I think the deeper problem here is that the way that we think about our emotions in modern society is quite simplistic, and in order to really know how to deal with our emotions, there are aspects of emotion that we should accept. There are aspects of emotion that we should change. And to understand that, we need to make a distinction between different parts of our emotional life. And the ancient Stoics do that in a more sophisticated way than we do today. They introduce terminology to separate the involuntary from the voluntary parts of our emotional life, for instance. But yeah, for sure, there are parts of our emotion that are involuntary and it's healthy for us to accept. And then there are parts that we neglect, which we could potentially take more control over.
And to complete the full circle of the conversation, that leads to what we said in the beginning. We should not deny emotions. Stoicism is not the denial of emotions. It's when you can accept emotions as they are and then manage those emotions in order for you to become the master of that instead of the slave of those emotions.
The Stoics like to say, throughout many of the ancient writings, this over and over again, they refer to this idea that the Stoic ideal is not to become like a man of stone or a statue or someone with a heart of stone, but rather it's to have healthy emotions and also to respond in a healthy way to negative emotions like fear, sadness, and anger.
So you could say, and we can say, that probably today people are reading less and they should read more. And for that reason, I'll suggest How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, which is a great book. And this new book, The Stoic Philosopher Mark Aurelius Verissimo, which is available where? Where can we find these books?
From any bookshops, and certainly from Amazon, and the Brazilian Portuguese translation is coming out. There's also a Portuguese translation of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. The graphic novel is going to be translated in Brazil too. But you can buy these books from Amazon or any online bookseller.
Okay. So for those who don't have this book, I recommend it.
Yeah, baby.
And Donald, I really appreciate your time for this conversation. It was a real pleasure to have you here. For those who like this talk, it will be available here in Instagram, and it will also be available in my YouTube channel. So it was a great pleasure to have you. I don't know if there's any questions from our viewers, but I had just some comments. And so if you have any questions about it, you can send it by message. And if necessary, I'll share it with you, Donald, for us to answer to our audience.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much then. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.